Edward Bennington has been charged with arson. He's accused of pouring petrol through the letterbox and igniting it, causing a small but severe fire in the Eaton Square home of Mr. Jeremy Clements, wealthy publisher. Mrs. Bennington is Mr. Clements' private secretary, and her husband, whom she's in the process of divorcing, has for some months been writing letters and making telephone calls to Mr. Clements, accusing him of an adulterous relationship with Mrs. Bennington. In front of the house there was discovered, during the fire, a sentence splashed on the pavement in blue paint, saying, "Stop screwing my wife," the phrase which has been invariably written by Bennington in letters he sent to Jeremy Clements.
Mr. O'Connor, I trust that I may accept your assurance that your client will make no further interruptions from the dog.
Yes, my lord.
Mrs. Bennington, you understand you're still on oath?
Oh, yes, my lord, I quite understand.
All right, Mr. Lotterby.
Mrs. Bennington, we have heard that you sometimes spent the night at the Clements home.
Yes, Mr. Clements and his partners used to have conferences twice a month. They usually went on quite late, and I always used to stay and take notes. But after the letters and the phone calls started, Mr. and Mrs. Clements thought I oughtn't to go home late at night to Barnes alone.
And you were at the Clements home on the 22nd of July when it caught fire.
Yes.
Now, you've told us that between April and today you had seen your husband just the once. Now,
Yes.
when was that?
It was on the day of the fire, at least before the fire.
When and where was this?
Well, I was just going to bed. I was drawing the curtains, and I looked outside, and I saw him outside the Clements house.
What time was this?
About midnight.
So it would have been dark outside.
I could see him quite clearly. He was under a street lamp.
What did you do?
Well, nothing. I just drew the curtains. I didn't think he could do any harm out there. After all, the house was locked.
I see. Now, Mrs. Bennington, one last question. Are there any grounds for your husband's accusations concerning yourself and Mr. Clements?
No, absolutely not.
Thank you, Mrs. Bennington.
Mrs. Bennington, you began working for Mr. Clements in December 1971, didn't you?
Yes, it was a week or two before Christmas.
So I understand. In fact, it was at a Christmas party that you first met Mr. Clements, I believe. A party given by his friend Charles Paxton, the architect.
Yes.
You had been private secretary to Mr. Paxton for about 4 months when you met Mr. Clements, who, perhaps we could say, stole you away from his friend to be his private secretary.
I don't think I would say stole me away. I'm not an object. I'm a businesswoman. Mr. Clements offered me more money.
Well, we might say that Mr. Clements outbid his friend for your services.
You might say that.
Before working for Mr. Paxton, you had a job for a few months with Henry Grange, the fashion photographer.
Yes.
In fact, your post as private secretary to Mr. Grange was your first job after you got married to Mr. Bennington, and the primary reason for your moving to London from Fulchester.
It was one of the reasons. I worked very irregular hours, and it would have been hard for me to commute.
So irregular, in fact, that you and your husband began to see less and less of each other.
We both worked very long hours.
And for the first time in your marriage, your husband began to drink rather heavily.
Yes, it was about then.
And in August, there occurred the first of the unfortunate incidents which you have described to us, when your husband's violent rage, his breaking of furniture and the rest of it resulted in the police being called in.
Yes.
Who called the police? Did you?
No, the neighbours did. I didn't even know the police had been called until they arrived.
I see. And the second incident of this kind occurred in early October, just after you'd started work for Mr. Paxton.
Yes.
And the third time that your husband was taken to the police station, again at the intervention of the neighbours and charged with disturbing the peace, was in December 1971, just after you had transferred your services from Charles Paxton to Jeremy Clements.
I have already told you my husband was fantastically jealous of any man I even spoke to.
Oh, yes, the milkman, baker, candlestick maker. To recap, Mrs. Bennington, you have had since your marriage 3 jobs as private secretary to 3 men. And there have been 3 incidents involving the police. Well, the pattern seems quite clear, does it not? You've been married once before, I believe.
Yes.
In April 1970, you married Mr. John Hamilton, a student at the Slade School of Art.
Yes.
Now, John Hamilton had been awarded the Prix de Rome shortly before you married him, hadn't he?
Yes.
You lived together in London after your marriage for a few months before your husband went to Rome. Did you go with him?
No, Mr. O'Connor, I don't see how the details of Mrs. Bennington's previous marriage can be of relevance.
My lord, my client married Mrs. Bennington, knowing that she had dropped her first husband, to whom she'd only been married a few months, in favour of himself. Within a few months of her marriage to my client, she'd taken the job as a private secretary to a highly successful fashion photographer.
But look, we're dealing with a specific offence.
My lord, it is my contention that the similarity of the situation awoke very deep fears in my client.
Well, I don't want it to be said that I'm not allowing you to develop your case as you think best. Right.
Mrs. Bennington, do you think it entirely coincidental that after your divorce your first husband suffered a severe mental breakdown, and now your second
Look, I've
husband
stood here and listened to you theorising about my life and my behaviour. If you've got a grain of intelligence, you'd know any relationship's a two-sided transaction. I simply couldn't have done that to those men, not unless they'd had an inbuilt desire for failure from the
Mrs.
beginning.
Look, I must call a halt to this debate, please. Look, if you have any concrete questions to put to Mrs. Bennington, will you please do so now? Please proceed with them.
Yes, my lord. Mrs. Bennington, it is clear that as soon as Mr. Clements saw the words painted on the pavement on the night of the fire, "Stop screwing my wife," he was convinced that the fire had been started by your husband. Did you also think this?
Well, how could it have been anybody else? The words were the same as were in the letters. Anyway, I saw him, I told you.
Oh, yes, you've told us that at about midnight on the night of July the 22nd, you looked out of the windows of the Clements house and you saw your husband looking up at the house.
Yes.
That, Mrs. Bennington, is quite untrue. It's just something that you've invented to add weight to the prosecution against your husband.
That's absurd. Why should I invent anything?
Because you're having an affair with Mr. Clements. And you want your divorce, your freedom. But you can't get it within 3 years of marriage unless you can prove exceptional depravity by your husband or exceptional hardship on you. And I expect you've been told this.
Look, I asked my lawyers to get a divorce. They said they'd do it as soon as possible, and that's all I know.
No, Mrs. Bennington, you know that you must prove exceptional depravity. An attempt to burn down a house with you in it will probably fit the bill.